let me come back to my topic, that is the new methodology we adopted in the new series. What changes we have introduced in the new series we announced in 2015. Why it has become so important? Because there are major comprehensive changes are introduced. Some have become controversial, some are obviously in consonance with the international practices. There is no issue related to them, but some changes which the government has made in the methodology have attracted some criticism and the clarifications. So therefore, we discussed them in briefly, and thereafter we'll discuss the trends in GDP, including the recent GDP estimates released by the National Statistical Office for 22-23. Therefore, with this brief background, let's see quickly the changes introduced. First change is obviously the base year changes, because as we move ahead, a lot of changes take place in the economy. New products are introduced, some of the old products are become obsolete, new qualitative changes are made, and therefore it is better to cover the changes took place in the economy over a period of time. And for that, we have to change the base year. And base year we have been changing right from the beginning. I have given some list of the base year we have changed in the past. In 1967, we changed the base year from 48, 49 to 60, 61. Similarly, the last change we did in 2010, when we shifted the base from 99 2000 to 2004-5. Therefore, you will observe that in the recent years, we are changing the base very frequently, because in the recent years, the structural changes are taking place in the economy, both on the production side as well as on the services side, and as well as the composition of GDP is fast changing. That's why the change in the base year is necessary. And in the last series, which was announced in 2015, we changed the base year from 2004-5 to 2011-12. This is a routine exercise. This is nothing new in that. But besides the change in the base year, the other two changes which introduced or which compelled to change the methodology is the change in the database. From 2004-5 until 11-12, the new sources of the database has emerged. New sources of databases have emerged in various fields. And therefore, if we continue with the existing data, ignoring the new sources of data, we are ignoring the structural changes that took place in the economy. Therefore, the new sources which have emerged and giving the extensive data in various sectors need to be adopted to give the comprehensive base for estimation of the GDP. And therefore, wherever the new sources of data have emerged or are available with us, we have introduced these new sources. The third compulsion with us is to make our GDP estimation methodology in consonance with the international guidelines issued by the UN System of National Accounts. And they have been issuing the guidelines from 1993, the second guideline, third guidelines in 2008. First guidelines they issued in 1968, which we have adopted. And therefore, to make our estimation procedure exactly in consonance with the international system, we have adopted the guidelines of the UN System of National Accounts. And therefore, some changes in the methodology are adopted. So what improvement we have made in our methodology and what changes we have introduced to make our estimation methodology to coordinate with the international UN System of National Accounts. First, I will discuss with the extension of the coverages. Extension of the coverage. First, I will discuss that. And then I'll move on to the changes, certain changes we introduced in the methodology. In corporate sector, in corporate sector, to incorporate or to cover the extensive data available now, we have started using the new data source. New data source which is available to us is in the form of the balance sheet and the profit and loss accounts submitted by the registered corporate sector with the registrar of companies in the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. And therefore the data is available uh, for the National Statistical Office to use for estimation of the gross product, gross output produced in the corporate sector. So far, we have been using the corporate sector output based on the RBI study. RBI publishes every year a study on company finances where their estimates are compiled based on the financial results of around 2,500 companies. And therefore, based on that study, we used to extrapolate the the performance of the other component of the corporate sector to incorporate in the GDP. But now, since the MCA 21 data is available, and therefore we started using the 5 lakh companies data to incorporate in estimation of the share of the corporate sector in the GDP. And therefore, after the revision of the series in 2015, 2011-12, 2012-13, the data is published both with the old methodology and the new methodology. And we find a lot of changes are there in the estimation of GDP with the use of the new data. Therefore, the first change introduced was the, the, the data of the corporate sector. Now, the analysis of the private sector contribution to GDP is based on the data of 5 lakh companies. Of course, gradually these were analyzed and the number of companies used somewhat decreased in the subsequent years, and we ignored and we excluded the shell companies which are not functional. But initially, the data provided by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs to the NSO was 5 lakh companies which were used in estimation of the GDP in 2011-12 and 12-13. The second change in the data was made regarding the wholesale and retail trade. Earlier, the contribution of this sector was based on the growth of the wages and employment in these sectors. Now, the contribution of wholesale and retail trade is made based on the sales tax return filed by the various traders in the prescribed format. And therefore, the sales tax returns provide you the huge data about the value of trade undertaken under the wholesale and retail trade practices. And therefore, instead of using the growth of wages and employment and then extrapolating the growth of the wholesale and retail trade, we started using directly sales tax return data to estimate the contribution of the trading sector in the GDP. And therefore, the two major data sources were changed to begin with. As far as the classification of the sectors, the classification of sectors is also revised from the new series of the GDP. And in financial corporations, the earlier we were just classifying the public sector, private sector, and whole, and the household sector. Now, within the private sector, the classification is done for the financial corporations, and therefore the financial sector earlier was using the limited data available uh, in the financial corporations. Now we are using the extensive data for the financial corporation, incorporating the earlier data as well as the data released by the stockbrokers, stock exchanges, asset management companies, mutual funds, pension funds, the SEBI, PFRDA, RDA. All these are the financial companies. And earlier we were using only the data from the banking sector, insurance sector, and few selected mutual funds. Therefore, the coverage of the data used in estimating the share of the financial corporations have also been extended, have also been extended. And now we are using the data released by uh, all kind of financial corporations. Similarly, in the local bodies and autonomous institutions, earlier we were using the limited data, that is seven autonomous institutions and the local bodies from four states only: Delhi, Himachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Uttar Pradesh. But in the revised series, we started picking up the local bodies and autonomous institutions, covering at least 60% of the grant and transfers provided by the central and the state governments. Therefore, the coverage of the local bodies and autonomous institution is also enhanced. Is also enhanced. Similarly, some of the important sources of data which have emerged in various sectors is also replaced. Is also replaced. For example, we have started using the NSS, this 68th round, 67th round, 70th round. All data is available with us. All India's livestock census is used, which is published in 2012. Similarly, other various sources publish the recent data in various sectors. And therefore, the old data is replaced by these new sources of data. So therefore, the first part of the change in the methodology is the extended coverage of data is used by the NSO for estimating their contributions in the GDP. Therefore, the first change is the extended coverage of the data in various sectors. The second change introduced was classification of enterprises. Classification of enterprises in the new series. Earlier, we used to classify the sector in three categories: public sector, private sector, and the household sector. Now we have extensively classified the institutions as recommended by the UN SNA to make it to make it perfectly in coordination with the international system of classification. We have reclassified our sectors. We have classified the enterprises in the new series as below. That is organized sector. Organized sector include the government sector, public financial, non-financial corporations, department enterprises or departmental commercial undertakings. Non-departmental enterprises or non-departmental commercial undertakings. These are the organized sectors. And in the private financial and non-financial corporations, we have classified them into two: the private incorporated enterprises, which are registered with the Registrar of Companies under the Companies Act, and those which are quasi corporations, and we have included the following under the quasi corporations. And third is obviously households or unorganized sector, enterprises which are not covered in either under the private financial or non-financial corporations or under the organized sector. We incorporate in the household sector. This is the classification we have done to in consonance with the UN SNA guidelines. The third change we have introduced in the methodology is the the in the estimation. You may recall that earlier we were estimating the GDP, either GDP at factor cost and GDP at market prices. Prior to the new GDP series, the NSO used to publish the data on GDP at factor cost and GDP at market prices. And GDP at factor cost was actually the sum of the payments made to various factors used in the process of production. And GDP at market price is basically measuring from the expenditure side done by the various groups: consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, government expenditure, and net exports. And then we used to say that the GDP at factor cost will be equal to GDP at market prices if we net them indirect taxes and add the subsidies. Add the subsidies. This was the system we were using earlier. But GDP at factor cost is not estimated anywhere in the world now. And that's why we have to replace the GDP at factor cost and the GDP or GVA at basic prices as recommended by the SNA. As recommended by the SNA. This is the major change we have introduced. GDP at market prices is ongoing as it was earlier. But GDP at factor cost is replaced by the GDP at basic prices. GDP at basic prices. Therefore, the factor cost is replaced by the basic prices. And now, therefore, the question is, what is the difference between factor cost and basic prices? What additional thing we include while estimating the GDP at basic prices? And therefore, to understand the difference between the basic prices and factor cost, we divide the indirect taxes into two categories. Indirect taxes imposed on the production of in the production process means that before the product is ready for the sale, the whatever taxes you have paid to the government in various forms is called the indirect taxes on the production. And whatever subsidy government give in the process for the process of production, they are deducted from that. And therefore, we use the indirect taxes on production net of subsidies. So the taxes on production is the taxes imposed by the government or duties paid to the government before the product is ready for the sale. For example, when you buy the land, you have to pay the rent, or if you register your property or land, you have to pay the registration fee. That is property, the registration fee to the government. And similarly, maybe you have to pay property taxes. These are the taxes and duties which are paid by the entrepreneur before the product is ready for the sale. And these are added to the factor cost. And all these taxes on production is calculated net of subsidies. Whatever subsidies received by these entrepreneurs from the government, that has to be net from the taxes. That has to be deducted from the taxes before incorporating them. And second classification of the indirect taxes is indirect taxes on product. That is when product is ready for the sale at the factory gate, when the product is ready and it is ready for sale to the wholesalers or the others, the whatever taxes is paid in the form of GST, etc., is included at that stage. And therefore, the second classification of direct taxes is indirect taxes on products. Here also we take them net of subsidies. So therefore, the indirect taxes are calculated, are classified into categories: indirect taxes on production, indirect taxes on products. And when we add for example, when we calculate the GDP at factor cost, with factor cost, what we add is indirect taxes on production. Indirect taxes on production. Therefore, the factor cost plus indirect taxes on production is equal to basic price. Is equal to basic price. In the earlier methodology, we were ignoring all taxes and duties paid by the entrepreneurs or by the firms, by the institutions before the production starts or before the product is ready for the sale. That we were ignoring earlier. We were only taking into account the payments made to various factors of production. When we add all these taxes and duties paid in the process of production to the government, it is added to the factor cost, we get the basic prices. And therefore, instead of calculating the GDP at factor cost, we started calculating now GDP at basic prices. This is the major change we have introduced. This is the major change we have introduced. And GDP at market price is is as usual as we were calculating earlier, and therefore it is continued as it is. It is continued as it is. As I mentioned in the previous class, the GDP at market prices is give you the idea about the expenditure made by the government or by the various groups in the economy. And GVA will give you the picture from the supply side. From the supply side, therefore GVA is always measured at the basic prices when and GDP is measured at the current prices. Current prices. Therefore, these changes were in the new methodology. I'll repeat, change in the base year, change in the data coverage in various sectors, change in the classification of the various institutions, and the change in the methodology of estimation of the GDP, and GDP factor cost is replaced by GDP at basic prices. And basic prices is very clearly defined. What basic prices is. I hope the changes we introduce is very, very clear to you. But after introducing the changes, you see the impact on the estimation of the GDP. You see that in 2012-13, when you adopt the 2004-5 series, the rate of growth of GVA factor was 4.5. 11-12 series is 4.7. But in 13-14, the major change. If you adopt the earlier series or earlier methodology, the GVA, the real growth in GVA was 4.9. But 11-12 series give you the GVA growth at 6.6. 6.6. Similarly, GDP at market prices. Because the coverage has extended. Coverage is extended significantly under the new series. And GDP at market prices earlier in 13-14, if you go by the old series, old methodology, it was 5%. But when you calculate at 11-12 series, this is 6.9%. Various, this is a significant change in estimation of the GDP. And since now we are trying to cover the as much data as available so that we can present the real change in the GDP of the country. And since we have reclassified the institutions, therefore the share of the corporate sector, share of the public sector, share of household sectors in gross savings and investment has also changed. And therefore the share of household sector has declined while the share of the private corporate sector has increased both in the savings and investment. This is mainly because of the classification, change in the classification of the institutions. Therefore, the major changes introduced in the form of the coverage of the data in various sectors. Since we have extended the coverage significantly in various sectors, and which has yielded the result in the form of the better estimates and better reflection in the growth of the GDP. This data is only just for your information that if you measure the GDP at current prices, and this will be the data, current prices. But if you measure the GDP at the constant prices, GDP is inflated. For 4, 5, 5, 6, 6, 7, you see, you compare the GDP, here 4, 5, you see the change in the GDP. You can see the change in the GDP. Change in the GDP, you see that in 2004-5, the GDP was this, and now the GDP was this. Change in the base year has expanded the GDP, the size of the GDP. Therefore, whenever we change the base year and when we change introduce the other changes, the GDP will change. Size of the GDP may change, but in 11-12 we have introduced significant changes. 4 changes I mentioned to you four changes were introduced in estimation of the GDP in the new GDP series started from the 2015 it was introduced, and therefore the base has changed from 2004-5 to 11-12. Major changes have made in the coverage of the data in various sectors, and we started using the latest data available in various sectors, which has improved the quality of the GDP estimation. But but the controversy has also begun when we adopted the new methodology, and therefore some people have still not happy with the way the GDP methodology has changed. And you see that why this controversy? Of course, you should not be indulging into this controversy, and hopefully no question will come of this controversy. But this is only for your information. And when we see the controversy, we'll also see what other changes have been used by the NSO in estimating the methodology. You see that 4-5 to 11-12 we consider to be the golden period for the India's economy. India's economy, using the old series, has uh, has estimated to grow at the rate of 9%, or at least the 8 to 10%. Only in 8-9 it was reduced because of the global financial crisis. But when we estimate the same year GDP using the new methodology and changing the base year, rate of growth declined almost in all the years. And this has generated the controversy. This has generated the controversy. And you find that the average rate of growth of the earlier period was around 7% or 8%. But when we take into account the new series, we found that the growth rate has been hardly 6.5%. Average growth rate from 4-5 to 11-12 has been the 6.5% or 6.1%. This has generated the controversy, and the people started saying that under the new methodology, under the new series of the GDP is overestimated. GDP is overestimated. GDP is overestimated. And you see that in this new GDP series, the three major changes observed. The service sector is the share of the service sector is reduced. Share of the primary and secondary sector has increased, and the unorganized and informal sector size is said to be reduced, and private corporate sector has expanded. And because of these implication of this new methodology, the controversy started. The first challenge people made was the use of the MCA data. That is the Ministry of Corporate Affairs data of 5 lakh companies. Because people say that these 5 lakh companies, many of them are not producing anything at all. Not producing anything at all. But their positive contribution is identified and taken, their positive contribution to GDP. That is first important change, and people criticize it. The overestimation bias in informal sector growth. It is assumed that in a particular sector we have a formal sector and the informal sector, and it is assumed that the rate at which formal sector is growing is also applied for the informal sector. Instead of collecting the data for the informal sector, the NSO applied the same rate of growth on the informal sector, while in reality informal sector is growing at a much less rate as compared to the formal sector. This has the pushed up the output from the same manufacturing sector or corporate sector. That's why the share of corporate sector has increased both in the GDP and in the savings and investment. That is the first bias has been observed by various experts. The second controversy was relating to the deflator. When we convert the nominal GDP into the real GDP, we have to use some deflator. We have to use some deflator, and normally we use the different deflator for output and different deflator for input. That is the double deflator we use, because the deflator for output is different from the deflator for the input. But in this methodology, single deflator is used. Single deflator is used. As a result, it overestimated the contribution. For example, in case of oil sector prices declined from 13, 14 onwards, but the actual prices have not declined, and therefore you are using the same deflator which you are using for output. It means that the contribution of the input sector is overestimated, and therefore the deflator controversy emerged. Deflator controversy has emerged. Other is the misclassification problem. Problem is that in the MCA data, that is the balance sheet data and the profit and loss data, which companies submit with the registrar of companies, it is difficult to identify how much is being produced in which sector and in which state. It is not possible to identify, because companies may be having the different plants and different offices in the different states. And when they submit the consolidated balance sheet, it is very difficult to identify from which state the data is coming. And therefore, this is likely to distort the estimation of the state-wise GDPs. And therefore, when MCA 21 data is filtered, we find that a lot of companies are not producing anything. They are just transferring the resources from one company to other company just for saving the taxes. And therefore, as a result, the number of companies included in the subsequent years for estimation of GDP is reducing, because the 50-60% of the companies are the shell companies in various sectors. In the earlier, we have included the all 5 lakh companies. But in the subsequent, when we filtered the companies, we find that the so many companies are shell, not producing anything physically. They are only transferring the product from one company to other company, no additional, no value added. And therefore, the 2.2 lakh companies are deregistered by the CSO in estimation. And therefore, the data corrections and data filtration is still going on. The other changes which introduced was essentially the enterprise approach. The approach here is that earlier the CSO had relied on the establishment approach, means that each company is submitting its data separately, and therefore a company is set up in a geographical boundary is considered to be independent unit, and it was submitting the data separately, and therefore the ASI, the Annual Survey of Industries, which was principal source for manufacturing data, was collecting the data under this approach, and they were collecting the data in the physical form, that is the industrial production. But in the enterprise approach, when we use the balance sheet of the firms, we are taking the value data, because balance sheet will give you the value of the output. And therefore, the change from establishment approach to enterprise approach means that we are shifting from the estimation of the volume to the estimation of the value. And this has created the major controversy. And this has supposed to overestimate the GDP. As I said, that the establishment approach, the unit was seen confined to a geographical boundary. geographical boundary, and the ASI is collecting the establishment approach while collecting the data and publishing it for manufacturing sector. But under the enterprise approach, the consolidated accounts of parent organizations are taken into consideration. Therefore, the parent office or the head office of the company, which is spending centrally on, say, the advertisement or in the finance function or in other centralized ancillary services, then that is also counted. In the establishment approach, that data is not counted. And therefore, the enterprise approach, the provided the boost to the share in the manufacturing sector, and therefore the manufacturing share is boosted. This is the criticism which is raised by the people. Similarly, fixed capital formation, that is, earlier we were using only the investment made in the construction and machinery and equipment. But now the fixed capital formation is classified under two sources. That is, apart from construction, machinery and equipment, the cultivated biological resources and intellectual property products are data is collected separately. Therefore, this classification of the fixed capital formation has also led to the overestimation of the data in some of the cases. Similarly, in case of the valuables, earlier the gold and jewelry occupied by the household was considered to be expenditure. But now the gold and jewelry the acquired by the households for their personal use or for social function is considered to be savings. Change in the definition, which has pushed up the saving estimation in the economy. Therefore, there are these changes which have been pointed out by many people, and I have quoted here the important paper of the Arvind Subramaniam, who is the earlier chief economic advisor in the government of India, and he calculated that if you see that post 2011 till 17, if you take the GDP growth, he estimated that the GDP growth is overestimated by 2.5 percentage points. 2.5 percentage points. And therefore, this generated the new controversy. And he said that this is mainly because of shift from the volume-based to value-based. But when we shift from volume-based to value-based, we have not clearly defined what deflator should be used. And we continue to use the earlier deflator, which has changed the system. And second reason, he said that we are proxying the growth of the informal sector based on the growth of the formal sector. We assume that the rate at which the formal sector is growing, informal sector is also growing at the same rate. And this has pushed up the share of the informal sector and therefore provided the boost to the GDP. And therefore, he estimated that during these years, you see that the blue one is the methodology. When the new methodology is adopted, this is the rate of growth. But when we made certain changes, as advised by the Subramaniam, the rate of growth is in this color 2.7, 3, 3.9, 4.9. It means on average the GDP is overestimated by 2.5 percentage point. But this controversy is still going on. But this controversy I have just discussed with you briefly to make you aware of that what are the changes we have introduced, whether the changes are what are the implications of these new changes, and whether they are accepted by the experts and the other people in the economy or not. But you confine yourself to the series which were using earlier and the new methodology we introduced. Because economic survey for 1920, they closed this debate. They said that from 11-12 to the 1718, they estimated the GDP both using the old methodology and the new methodology. And they found that the difference is insignificant. If government in economic service says that the difference is insignificant, then obviously the controversy should rest. But controversy is still there. But we are continuously using the new methodology to estimate the GDP. And therefore, you should only confine yourself to understand what was the earlier methodology and what are the changes we have introduced in the new series of GDP started from 2015. I hope I have made you aware of the changes we have introduced in the estimation of the GDP. In the next demo class, I will discuss with you the trends in GDP, particularly after 11-12, and focusing on the recent estimates of the GDP. And at the end, I'll also discuss with you the data released just on 31st May, and the provisional estimate for 22-23. The next one class or maybe two classes will be used only in discussing the trends in the GDP in the last 10 years, so that you will be aware of the GDP chapter completely. What GDP is, we have discussed what methodologies we have used, we have discussed what changes in methodology we have introduced, we have discussed, and based on that, what are the trends in the GDP in the years to come. That we shall discuss in the next class. And I hope you are getting the issues which I am raising. Okay, thank you very much. But don't forget to take the decision of number one. If you are really serious for 24, this is the right time to join any coaching if you want. And this is the right time to start. The coaching for the optional people. Right time to start making the selection of the optional people. And you apply your due diligence in selection of the optional people. But once you decide it, then go for it. And if you want the guidance and material and help, I tell you with confidence that Sriram IS is the best in the market today. You join and you will find the difference. You see that I am teaching their economics as an optional paper also. And you see the difference. We are introducing economics from this year. I'm already taking classes on Unacademy platform. But the other teachers are even better than me. Of course, I am a new one in this area. I have left the government. I retired from the government and joined this new job to share my experience in the economics with you. Okay, then see you, and all the best to all of you. And I hope you will join in the next class, so that we are in continuity. You will understand the GDP and related issues. Thank you very much.